The International Airport Liberty Skyport in New York was as bustling as ever. The sound of hurried footsteps blended with multilingual announcements echoing continuously over the intercom system. A woman's voice in German faded away, immediately replaced by a soft voice in Spanish, warning about unattended luggage. The rich aroma of roasted coffee drifted from a nearby Starbucks, intertwining with the faint scent of jet fuel lingering near the boarding gates. Jackson Reed appeared, not with fanfare or ostentation, but with an air of calm composure. He was a black man in his early 50s, wearing a faded denim jacket over a gray cashmere sweater, simple khaki trousers, and a pair of well-worn walking shoes. In his hand, he carried an old leather briefcase, a symbol of years spent on countless journeys. The briefcase bore faint scratches that glimmered under the sunlight, as if each mark whispered a story about Jackson's past. His posture leaned slightly forward as he walked, not fast but steady. His eyes, framed by thin-rimmed glasses, exuded calmness and a touch of weariness, not merely from travel, but from a lifetime of facing prejudice and judgment. But today his steps felt lighter than usual. For the first time in years, Jackson allowed himself to shed the title of a renowned CEO and experience the world through the lens of an ordinary man. As he approached the first-class check-in counter, a flight attendant named Rebecca greeted him. Her blonde hair was neatly tied in a bun, and her uniform was impeccable. Her smile was polite, yet there was a trace of scrutiny in her eyes. Rebecca hesitated briefly when she saw Jackson. Her gaze swept over his modest clothing and the weathered leather briefcase. Suspicion flickered in her expression. "Sir, are you sure this is the first-class boarding area?" Rebecca asked, her voice gentle but tinged with doubt. Jackson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he calmly placed his briefcase on the floor, reached into his jacket pocket for his boarding pass, and handed it to her. His gaze remained steady, unwavering in the face of her scrutiny. As Rebecca examined the boarding pass, another voice rang out from behind him. "Looks like someone got their first-class ticket mixed up with a Greyhound bus pass," a man said with a sneer and a soft chuckle. It was Richard Turner, a businessman in an expensive suit. His face radiated self-satisfaction, and his gaze swept over Jackson as though Jackson didn't belong there. A flicker of anger flashed in Jackson's eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. He took a deep breath, picked up his briefcase, and looked directly at Rebecca. "Is my boarding pass valid?" he asked, his voice calm but resolute. Rebecca's expression faltered for a moment under the weight of Jackson's unwavering demeanor. She glanced back down at the boarding pass and confirmed that it was indeed valid. However, her initial prejudice was still faintly visible in her flustered expression. "You may proceed to the gate, Mr. Reed," Rebecca said, striving to maintain her professionalism. Jackson could feel the gazes of those around him following his every move, but he remained undeterred. With a graceful motion, he picked up his briefcase and stepped past the checkpoint, leaving behind the suspicious glances and whispered remarks. Inside, Jackson felt a profound sadness, but it was accompanied by a firm resolve. He knew that this journey wasn't just a flight, it was a chance to witness firsthand the biases that society still harbored, hidden yet very much alive, even in a modern and supposedly enlightened world. Jackson stepped into the first-class boarding line, where passengers were preparing for their flight. The dim, warm lights bathed the area, but they did little to ease the tension quietly brewing within him. He could feel the scrutinizing glances from a few fellow passengers as their eyes briefly took in his modest attire and his old leather briefcase. Jackson stood tall, his steps steady and unshaken, as if nothing could rattle his composure. Before Jackson could move further, a voice rang out, drawing everyone's attention. "Well, isn't this interesting? Looks like anyone can get into first class these days, huh?" Richard Turner, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, stood near the line. His eyes gleamed with mockery and disdain, his lips curling into a provocative smile. Turner, a wealthy businessman with meticulously styled hair, exuded the smugness of someone who believed he belonged to an exclusive, superior class. Jackson stood still for a moment, his eyes reflecting a brief flicker of surprise before he quickly regained his calm. He turned to face Turner, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if silently saying, "I don't owe you an explanation." But inside, a quiet wave of disappointment and anger welled up, not because of the words themselves, but because of the familiarity of such prejudice. Turner wasn't finished. He chuckled and leaned toward the woman next. Turner wasn't finished. He chuckled and leaned toward the woman next to him, who was wearing a designer dress. People like that should know their place. Coach is a few gates down, he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Rebecca, the flight attendant stationed at the gate, witnessed the entire scene. Her face briefly registered discomfort, but she quickly resumed her professional demeanor. Yet as she glanced at Jackson's attire, a hint of doubt flickered in her eyes. "Sir," Rebecca began, her voice polite but cold, "are you sure your ticket is for first class?" Jackson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gently placed his briefcase on the floor, opened it carefully, and retrieved his boarding pass. He handed it to Rebecca with a calm smile, his gaze remaining steady and confident. Rebecca examined the boarding pass slowly, her eyes scanning every detail. For a moment, confusion and embarrassment flashed across her face when she realized the ticket was indeed valid. "My apologies, sir," Rebecca said, her voice softening as she returned the ticket. "Please proceed." Jackson gave a slight nod, took the ticket, and walked past Turner without saying a word. He could feel Turner's eyes following him, but he ignored them, maintaining his outward composure, even though a faint ache lingered within. As Jackson passed through the gate, a memory from his childhood surfaced, a time when his family was denied service at a small-town restaurant. The server had looked at them with the same judgmental gaze Rebecca had just shown, a silent but undeniable act of prejudice. He could still recall the quiet fury in his father's eyes and the way his father had stayed calm to shield the family from humiliation. Though that memory was painful, it had shaped Jackson into who he was today, strong, composed, and always maintaining his dignity. Jackson entered the first-class lounge area. The other passengers glanced at him curiously, some trying to hide their discomfort, but he paid them no mind. He chose a seat by the window, placed his leather briefcase on the floor, and let out a quiet sigh. Without uttering a single word, his very presence sent a powerful message. "I belong here, and I don't need anyone's permission to prove it." When the boarding gate officially opened, Jackson slowly lined up with the other first-class passengers. The warm LED lights above cast a soft glow on the plush carpet below. Footsteps echoed, light but hurried. The flight attendants' polite greetings, paired with their perfect smiles, created an atmosphere that seemed entirely upscale and welcoming. However, as Jackson stepped into the first-class cabin, he quickly realized that the atmosphere wasn't as friendly as it seemed. The first-class cabin exuded luxury. The caramel leather seats, the soft ambient lighting, and the gleaming luggage compartments all added to the sense of opulence. The faint scent of lilies from a small vase at the service counter evoked a feeling of comfort and relaxation. But the mood shifted when Jackson entered. Curious glances immediately fixated on him. A few people looked down, as though avoiding eye contact, while others stared openly, their expressions tinged with surprise and thinly veiled discomfort. A woman in an elegant dress, with sparkling earrings and a flawless hairstyle, turned her head away, her displeasure obvious. A man in a tailored suit lowered his Wall Street Journal, glanced at Jackson from head to toe, and raised an eyebrow before returning to his paper. Jackson quietly made his way to his seat, 1A, the coveted window seat at the front of the cabin. He carefully placed his worn leather briefcase in the overhead compartment, fully aware of the stares still following him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but a sense of unease stirred within him. He sank into his seat, feeling the smooth premium leather beneath him. Yet instead of relaxing, he felt the cabin's atmosphere tighten around him. An unusual silence filled the air, punctuated only by faint whispers that failed to hide the underlying judgment. Before he could fully settle in, Rebecca, the flight attendant from the gate, appeared beside him. "Can I help you with your bag, sir?" she asked, her smile strained, her voice sweet but tinged with doubt. "No, thank you," Jackson replied, his tone gentle yet firm as his calm eyes met hers. Rebecca seemed to linger for an extra moment, as if trying to confirm something, before turning away. Her gaze swept over the other passengers, and her smile became more natural as she greeted them. As Jackson tried to find some peace of mind, a voice from behind him pulled him back to reality. "So anyone can sit in first class now?" He didn't need to turn around to know it was Richard Turner. The mocking tone in Turner's voice was unmistakable, and the faint giggle from a woman nearby only added to the tension. Jackson took another deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. Instead of responding, he opened his briefcase, took out an old magazine, and began flipping through its pages as though oblivious to the words being thrown his way. The silence didn't last long before Rebecca returned, this time with a tray of drinks. She moved through the cabin, cheerfully serving the other passengers before stopping at Jackson's seat. "Would you like something to drink? Water or wine?" she asked, her gaze cooler than when she served the others. "Just water, please," Jackson replied. Rebecca set the glass of water on his tray table but didn't leave immediately. She stood there for a moment, her eyes studying him before she spoke again. "It's interesting to see such diversity in first class, isn't it?" Jackson looked directly at her. His eyes didn't show anger, only unwavering resolve. "Everyone has the right to sit wherever they have a valid ticket," he said, his voice calm but full of meaning. Rebecca said nothing more. She gave a brief nod and walked away. Jackson returned to his magazine, but his mind no longer absorbed the words. He knew this flight wouldn't be an ordinary trip. This was a test of patience, dignity, and his ability to confront the prejudice that still lingered. Outside the window, the clear blue sky blurred slightly as the plane prepared for takeoff, marking the beginning of a journey filled with unexpected challenges and revelations. The gentle hum of the engines blended into the luxurious atmosphere of the first-class cabin. Jackson leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the wide sky outside the window, trying to focus on the vastness ahead. But Richard Turner's cruel words and Rebecca's scrutinizing gaze still echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of the prejudice he had faced throughout his life. He quietly took a deep breath, letting a sense of calm gradually overpower the simmering anger. In that moment, a childhood memory resurfaced. Jackson recalled a rainy afternoon in a small southern town. He was just a boy, accompanying his parents to a restaurant after his brother's graduation ceremony. They were dressed neatly, ready for a simple, celebratory meal. But as soon as they stepped inside, the restaurant manager's cold stare stopped them in their tracks. "Sorry, but we don't serve people like you," the man said, his tone both polite and icy. Jackson's father, a proud man who never bowed to injustice, remained calm, though his clenched hands trembled with anger. "We're not asking for anything except fairness," he replied, his gaze full of dignity. But his father's words changed nothing. They left in silence, carrying the weight of humiliation and pain. That memory haunted Jackson, not just because of the injustice, but because he had seen the quiet hurt in his father's eyes. Jackson pushed aside the painful memory and refocused on the present. He reminded himself that challenges, big or small, could never strip away his dignity and composure. This wasn't the first time he had faced such prejudice, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Rebecca approached him again, this time with a silver tray holding a hot towel. She leaned slightly toward him, her forced smile still in place. "Hot towel, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but lacking sincerity. Jackson nodded, took the towel, and murmured a quiet thank you. He could feel her eyes still observing him, as if waiting for him to make a mistake to confirm that he didn't belong in this space. "Is there anything else you need?" Jackson asked, his tone calm, his gaze direct and unwavering. Rebecca seemed momentarily taken aback. She straightened and answered briefly, "No, thank you, sir." She walked away, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. He realized this was not just a personal trial, but part of a larger battle, a fight to prove that a person's worth and dignity weren't defined by appearances or social standing. Just as Jackson was about to open his magazine to read, a woman's voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, you bumped into me and didn't even apologize." Jackson turned around and saw a young woman in an expensive dress, her face flushed with anger. He furrowed his brow, trying to recall if he had done anything wrong. "Ma'am, I believe you're mistaken," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Mistaken?" she repeated loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Unbelievable. Some people just don't know how to behave in civilized society." As the tension grew, Elena, the young flight attendant, stepped forward with a resolute expression. "Ma'am," Elena said, her voice calm but firm, "I witnessed the entire incident. The gentleman did not bump into you. Perhaps you misunderstood. The woman fell silent, her face briefly showing embarrassment before she turned away, muttering something indistinct. Jackson looked at Elena, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "It's nothing, sir," Elena replied, smiling sincerely. "It was the right thing to do." Jackson felt a small sense of relief. Though prejudice still lingered, this moment felt like a tiny flickering light, rekindling his faith in people. He silently resolved to continue this journey with patience and self-respect, refusing to let anyone or anything shake his determination. The plane began to climb higher, heading toward the clear blue sky. For Jackson, this trip was not just a physical journey. It was a test of faith, character, and the enduring value of human dignity. The plane had reached cruising altitude when Rebecca, the head flight attendant, approached Jackson again. This time she was accompanied by Captain Stevens, a middle-aged man with an imposing presence, dressed in his pilot's uniform. There was a slight glimmer of doubt in the captain's eyes as he looked at Jackson. "Sir," Captain Stevens began, his voice steady and authoritative, "I've been informed there may have been some confusion regarding your seat. We just want to verify your ticket to ensure everything is in order." Jackson looked up from his magazine. His eyes didn't show anger, but there was a clear hint of disappointment. He set the magazine down on the tray table, slowly reached into his leather briefcase, and handed his ticket to Rebecca. Rebecca took the ticket and examined it thoroughly, her eyes scanning every detail. She opened her tablet to compare the ticket against the passenger manifest, and for a brief moment, uncertainty crossed her face. "The ticket is valid, sir," she finally said, her voice growing softer. Captain Stevens glanced at Rebecca, then back at Jackson. "I apologize for the inconvenience. We just wanted to make sure there was no mistake," he said, though there was still a trace of skepticism in his tone. Jackson remained calm. "I understand, Captain," he replied evenly, "but I believe this level of suspicion is unnecessary without reasonable cause." Captain Stevens gave a small nod, as though feeling a flicker of guilt, and turned to leave. Rebecca lingered for a moment, her face showing embarrassment, but she said nothing. After a few seconds, she too walked away. As soon as Rebecca and Captain Stevens left, Richard Turner, seated 2 rows away, couldn't resist the chance to jeer. "Looks like they had their doubts about you, my friend," Turner called out loudly enough for others to hear. "But don't worry, you passed the test. Must have been your lucky day." Jackson looked up at Turner, his eyes cold but silent. Inside, he felt a surge of anger rising, but he quickly suppressed it. He knew that engaging Turner would only feed the man's smugness. Just as the tension began to ease, another passenger, a young woman with an air of authority, stood up and pointed directly at Jackson. "Excuse me, but I feel uncomfortable sitting near him," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate. "I don't think he belongs here." Her words thickened the air with unease. Some passengers averted their gazes, as though unwilling to get involved, but many remained intently focused on the unfolding scene. Jackson turned and faced the woman. Before he could say anything, Elena, the young flight attendant who had defended him earlier, stepped forward with calm determination. "Ma'am," Elena said, her voice steady but firm, "this passenger has a valid ticket and every right to be here. If you feel uncomfortable, we'll do our best to find you another seat, but that has nothing to do with him." The woman stood silent, unsure how to respond to Elena's unwavering stance. She muttered something under her breath and sat down, her face flushed with obvious embarrassment. Jackson turned to Elena, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you again," he said softly. Elena gave a slight smile. "It was the right thing to do, sir." As the cabin slowly returned to normal, Jackson gazed out the window, his eyes distant. He wondered why, after all the progress society had made, prejudice could still run so deep and blatant. But he also knew that if he allowed these experiences to defeat him, all his efforts and successes would lose their meaning. He reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who endured injustice without a voice. Jackson resolved that he wouldn't sit idly by and become a victim. He would turn this experience into a lesson for everyone. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere gradually resumed its calm. But for Jackson, he knew that his true journey was only just beginning. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, The tension in the first-class cabin seemed to ease, but for Jackson, the storm still simmered beneath the surface. He knew the suspicion and discrimination he had faced wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much deeper, the persistence of prejudice in society. Rebecca, the head flight attendant, appeared once more, her face serious. She approached Jackson, her voice low but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sir, I'm afraid we need you to step away from your seat so we can further verify your ticket. There appears to be an issue with the system." Jackson looked up, his gaze steady, his disappointment evident. "I've already provided a valid ticket, and you've checked it. What more do you need?" he asked. Rebecca maintained a professional demeanor, though there was hesitation in her tone. "I understand, sir, but this is a necessary procedure to ensure everything is correct." Not wanting to escalate the situation, Jackson stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and followed Rebecca toward the galley. But he could feel the stares of the other passengers following him, some curious, others appearing satisfied, as if they were eager to see him exposed. In the galley, Rebecca tried to remain composed as she checked the ticket again, comparing it with the passenger manifest on her tablet. But this time, Jackson, sensing the silent scrutiny, decided he'd had enough. He slowly opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a small wallet. From it, he retrieved an intricately designed business card embossed with bold lettering. He handed the card to Rebecca, his gaze calm but resolute. "This is who I am," he said. "I chose to take this flight without the trappings of status or wealth, but it seems some people here need a reminder that a person's dignity isn't defined by their appearance." Rebecca stared at the card, her eyes widening in shock. She stammered an apology, but her embarrassment was unmistakable. Jackson returned to his seat, but this time, he carried himself with an even greater sense of purpose. He didn't need to speak for his presence to resonate. His silence carried more weight than any words. Standing in the aisle, Jackson held up his business card for all to see. "My name is Jackson Reed," he announced, his voice clear and unwavering. "I am the CEO of Reed Holdings, and my ticket is valid." The atmosphere in the cabin froze. Several passengers, including Richard Turner, sat motionless, their faces pale. Rebecca stepped back, unsure of what to say, while Elena, the young flight attendant, stood nearby with admiration in her eyes. A few passengers began to clap, and soon the support spread through the cabin. A woman seated nearby looked down awkwardly, while Richard Turner remained still, unable to meet Jackson's gaze. Elena approached Jackson and offered him a soft smile. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Jackson nodded. "Sometimes silence isn't the way to confront injustice," he replied. As the commotion began to settle, Jackson returned to his seat and gazed out of the window at the sky beyond. He felt a sense of relief, though his mind was still weighed down by the significance of what had just transpired. He wondered, would this moment lead to any real change? Would someone in this cabin rethink their assumptions and confront their own biases? The plane continued its journey in silence, but for Jackson, the fight against prejudice had just taken a meaningful step forward. After the incident on the plane, Jackson Reed's story began to spread rapidly. The passengers who had witnessed his composure and determination couldn't stop recounting the event once they landed. Some had even recorded the moment Jackson stood up and introduced himself, posting the videos on social media. Within hours, the hashtag number #DignityWithJackson began trending. The videos and posts quickly gained traction online, drawing thousands of comments and shares. Most people expressed admiration for how Jackson had handled the situation. One person wrote, "He didn't just stand up for himself, he stood up for everyone who has ever been judged by their appearance." Meanwhile, Skyline Airways, the airline operating Jackson's flight, faced intense criticism. An op-ed by a prominent journalist posed the question, if someone like Jackson Reed can face this kind of discrimination, what must other passengers endure? The airline was forced to issue a public statement apologizing for the incident and promising an internal investigation. A few days later, Jackson received an email from Richard Turner, the man who had mocked him on the flight. In the email, Richard wrote, "Dear Mr. Reed, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for my behavior. I realize now that I was wrong to judge you based on your appearance. Your actions have forced me to confront the biases I didn't even know I carried." Jackson smiled as he read the message. He knew that true change began with individuals taking an honest look at themselves. The widespread attention didn't just put public pressure on Skyline Airways, it also led to significant reforms. The airline announced a series of changes, including diversity and anti-bias training. All employees, from flight attendants to pilots and management, were required to participate in regular training sessions on fair and respectful customer service. Improved incident handling. The airline enhanced its conflict resolution and complaint systems, making it easier for passengers to report instances of unfair treatment. Recognition for outstanding employees. Elena, the young flight attendant who had defended Jackson, was awarded a commendation for her courage and accountability. She was also invited to serve as an advisor for the airline's new training program. Jackson didn't stop there. He decided to use the momentum to push for broader change. He announced the creation of the Wings of Change Foundation, dedicated to supporting students from underprivileged communities in pursuing careers in aviation. He invited Elena to join the foundation as an advisor and partnered with Richard Turner, who had offered to contribute financially to the program. "We can't change everything overnight," Jackson said at a press conference, "but every small act, every personal change, adds up to a more just world." Skyline Airways not only changed its internal policies, but also became a symbol of its commitment to inclusion. The airports managed by the airline began displaying a new slogan: "Respect takes flight," a reminder that every passenger deserves fair and kind treatment. One late evening, Jackson sat in his office looking out the window at the city lights below. He felt a sense of pride, but he also understood that the fight for equality was far from over. Still, he believed that every step forward, no matter how small, was meaningful. His phone rang. It was Elena. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "No, Elena," Jackson replied. "Thank you for having the courage to speak up. You've made a difference." Jackson set the phone down and gazed at the night sky through the window. He knew that the flight that day had become more than just a personal journey. It had sparked a movement, challenging people to rethink their biases. And for Jackson, that was what truly mattered. Jackson Reed's story continued to spread, becoming a symbol in the fight against prejudice and injustice. Interviews, articles, and even social justice conferences referenced the event on the flight. His name appeared in major newspapers like the New York Times and The Guardian, not only as a successful businessman, but as an unwavering advocate for equality. The Wings of Change Foundation he established quickly garnered widespread support. Major corporations, including Richard Turner's company, pledged to fund scholarships and vocational training programs for young people from disadvantaged communities. One day, Jackson received a letter from Rebecca, the head flight attendant who had treated him disrespectfully on the flight. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Reed, I want to offer my sincerest apology. I feel ashamed when I look back on my actions. You taught me a lesson not just about dignity, but about owning up to mistakes and making changes. I hope you can forgive me." Jackson smiled as he read her words. He saw not just remorse, but hope in her heartfelt message. He wrote back, "Rebecca, we all have the capacity to change. What matters is that you've realized it and are ready to move forward. I forgive you and hope you'll use this lesson to make positive changes in your life." Meanwhile, at the Reed Holdings factory, reconstruction after the fire was nearly complete. Jackson personally visited the site to inspect the progress and ensure all the new safety measures had been implemented. He met with the injured workers, listening to their stories and offering them words of encouragement. Their resilience fueled his determination to create a safer and fairer work environment. Skyline Airways, facing public pressure, implemented sweeping reforms. Slogans such as "Fly high with respect" appeared in airports nationwide, along with employee training programs focused on diversity and anti-bias practices. Elena, the young flight attendant who had stood up for Jackson, was promoted and became a role model within the company. In an interview, she said, "I used to be afraid of speaking up for what was right, but that flight taught me that silence is complicity. We need to speak out when we see injustice because that's the only way we create change." The Wings of Change Foundation began awarding scholarships to students from underserved communities, giving them access to aviation, engineering, and management programs. Some young beneficiaries shared moving stories of how the foundation's support had helped them overcome hardship and transform their lives. Even Richard Turner, once solely focused on profit, began to change. At a joint press conference with Jackson, he admitted, "We're not defined by what we achieve, but by the values we leave for the next generation. And I know where I need to start." A few months later, Jackson found himself back at Liberty Skyport. This time, he wasn't dressed modestly as part of an experiment. He wore a sleek suit, not to boast, but to continue his mission of inspiring a fairer world. As he walked to the check-in area, he noticed a large poster featuring Elena, with the words, "Respect is the key to the skies." Jackson smiled, feeling the change unfolding around him. At the check-in counter, the staff greeted him with a genuine smile. There were no scrutinizing looks, no doubtful remarks. This time, he was simply a traveler preparing for a new journey. As he settled into his seat on the plane, Jackson gazed out the window. The plane began to ascend, lifting off the ground and soaring into the blue sky. He felt the freedom, not just in the air, but in his heart and mind.